Hi, Nick Erickson here. In this episode, Nick, Garrett, and myself unpack common perceptions of the words religion and spirituality. We felt as though this would be a great foundational episode for our podcast, as it allows us to open from as near first principle as possible. As the conversation progresses, we get the opportunity to imagine how different people view religion and spirituality, not only in our modern era, but also in ages past. We hope you enjoy the conversation. And welcome back to the North Star Podcast. Today we are going to be defining what is a religion. I think it would be helpful to kind of kick off this episode just with kind of like what baggage or what kind of connotations that word carries along with it. I feel when I talk about religion with people throughout life, one conception I encounter a lot is that religion essentially equals monotheism, which is kind of easy to understand because, monotheism's kind of dominated the past millennia. So I just kind of wanted to go around the table here and see what kind of stuff that you've encountered people react to that word or anything kind of relevant.
Well, I guess if I can jump in, first thing I would say is I'm not sure that we aren't aiming a little high to say we're going to define religion. This is something people have tried to define often for a long time in very contradictory ways. And it may be the kind of thing that can't quite be defined because it's such a sort of just difficult concept. There are a lot of things like that where you can talk about how different members of the set resemble each other or something, but ultimately coming up with a concise definition of what it is that makes everything into a member of that group. What makes every religion a religion is more difficult. So I think maybe more accurately, we'll at least talk around the concept of religion and hopefully have some sort of guide points, standpoints for recognizing what a religion is, and hopefully then for being able to narrow down what kind of thing our religions are and are not.
I think one of the things that I tend to run into is this idea that religion is a discrete subset of human life, and it's something that can be, take it or leave it, right? You can either be religious or you can be non-religious. And I actually disagree with that idea. I think that idea is based upon a misunderstanding of what a religion is, probably due to the overwhelming influence that monotheistic religions have had in Western culture over the last 1,000 years. And more in defining what religion is, right? I think that a lot of the people who are opposed to religion as such are opposed to religion as it's defined by, say, Christianity. I think that what religion actually is something a lot bigger than that. And I'm not going to pretend to be able to easily say what that is, but I want to refer to some things that the Romanian scholar Mircea Eliade said about religion, especially in terms of his idea of homo religiosus, the idea that humanity is religious by nature, that human nature just is religion. In other words, that no human culture, no group of people identify as such that is made up of human beings can be anything other than religious, due to the underlying structure of human mentation, human thought. Some examples of that are that you have explicitly non-religious social movements or ideologies of cultures that nevertheless have the same structure as religion does and have the same place in them for some sort of ideology that defines what existence is and what it's about. Right? Eliade also talked about how the underlying structure of Messianic Judaism is inherent in not only Christianity, not only Islam, but also movements like fascism and communism, right? These are vast ideologies that take over entire cultures, and they do so in much the same way that Abrahamic religions did, because the underlying ideology is the same. And if what you're converting from an Abrahamic religion to one of these ideologies is the same shape, it's much easier to cause that to happen, right? It's much easier to propagate that throughout a culture. But I think that we can see that some of these, again, explicitly or externally non-religious ideologies, how harmful that they've been through the 20th century. It is much more beneficial to be upfront and explicit about being religious. I think that societies are much better served when they understand that human nature requires religion of some sort or another, and is explicit about trying to fill that niche.
So we were talking about kind of either taking it or leaving it, either being religious or not. I have some statistics on this that I'd like to share with you guys. 65% of Americans, this is a study done in 2002, 65% of Americans label themselves as religious and spiritual. 15 to 20 call themselves spiritual but not religious. And then 5 to 10% say they are religious but not spiritual. And then another 5 to 10% say neither neither religious or spiritual. What do you guys think the distinction is, or what's your reaction to that?
To begin with, I would suspect that number has changed, right?
I would think some, but how much I was thinking about this earlier today. I was like, I think that it's somewhat of a constant.
But I think there are more people who consider themselves non-religious or spiritual. I think that both the idea of spirituality and religion have undergone some real, devalorization or something over the past 20 years.
So you think that second category of spiritual but not religious has grown?
I'm honestly not sure. Very possibly, because certainly, so this maybe starts getting back to where we started and didn't hit, which is your question about monotheism and people who define religion as that. I think it's very clearly the case that this is because in our culture, the big example of religion for, 1,000, 1,500 years, depending upon what part of the world that, you were in, was monotheistic or is. That was the hegemonic view. There was the Christian church, or maybe you were a Jew or something, but it was one God. And, sure, there were also pagans, but pagans were just wrong and they weren't really religious anyway, right? So I think that what has happened is that with a lot of the scandals around things like the Catholic Church, and with just a general sense that a lot of people have that church just ain't the thing to do anymore, churches are massively more empty than they used to be. Mm-hmm. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I don't get into churches very much, but, members of my family die and I go to funerals and stuff like that. So sometimes they get married and I go to church for that or whatever. And I have found that almost every time I do that, a good example is probably my grandmother died a few years back. Went to the church where she had been and was talking to a cousin of mine about it. And he was talking about how when he was a kid, how active and busy that church had been. And now it's just, quite dead, really. I mean, there's still something going on. People still show up for church on Sunday. It's in a small town, but there's not much going on. And that seems to be universal. Every church I've been to, I've heard exactly that. Now, I haven't gone to any of these like mega churches, which seem to be more sort of an entertainment experience than a religious one. But so I don't know. Maybe it's just that it's all moving. But my suspicion is that there's more people who are just not spiritual or religious or claim to be. Mm-hmm. And there are also probably more people who are spiritual but not religious. I think those are probably the growing categories, whereas religious or religious and spiritual are the shrinking categories over the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. But to go back and think about that distinction, I would say that in general, religion is collective, spirituality is individual.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just based on, in many ways, these terms are so very sort of free-floating. People use them without having a good sense of what they are, and you kind of have to develop a definition after the fact rather than knowing that people are using a good definition to begin with. But my sense is that when someone tells me they're spiritual and not religious, it means that they have some kind of belief in some kind of transcendent something. Maybe it's Jesus, maybe it's, the Great Spirit, maybe it's the universe, but they're not going to church about it. It may even be a completely conventional Western concept of God, but they don't want to go to church.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, the individual versus collective is part of it. But I think that what ties into that is that people conceive of religion as being this highly structured thing with an organization behind it, right? And with a set doctrine and dogma and set of practices that are relatively inflexible, right? It comes to you as a body of practice and as a community of people and as a body of lore that you're not allowed to pick and choose from. You have to take it all or leave it. So when a lot of people that I've met who describe themselves or define themselves explicitly as spiritual but not religious, what they're talking about is that their religion is not structured, which it doesn't need to be because it's individual.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
right?
yeah.
I think that there is a certain point at which, due to bad experiences with the sort of highly structured religion that we've had over the last millennia or so, people are afraid of religious structure. This isn't a very important point. They're afraid of religious tradition. They're afraid of what they might see as the, not stultification, the stagnancy of an established religious tradition that does not seem to be open to any new influences or any new input. And so they go off on their own and they, very often, cherry pick what they like from a lot of different religions, or they, again, as you said, they might stick to a very sort of standard Western conception of religion and God. But they feel a lot freer to add or subtract what they want to. Mm-hmm. And we've run into this before where I think, people on this, the audience will find out as we progress through this podcast that what we have is actually a religious tradition. It's new, quite new, using old things and continually researching and trying to find old practices. But as it fits together as a practice is relatively new. But we're not trying to have a religion without a set body of practice. We actually think that a body of practice and some sort of structure is a good thing. It's a positive thing, but it needs to be there without being closed off. It has to be somewhat open-ended so that it can continue to develop as new things are learned. And we're in a good place right now. You could say that, as much as we would like to have a complete set of traditions handed down to us, which of course no heathen these days has, we're in a position where we have to maintain an openness because we never know what we might learn tomorrow.
I would say we're maybe getting a little far from still defining what religion is.
I have an interesting bit of etymology here that I think fits in and ties together a couple of these ideas. The word religion dates back to around the 1200s, which is interesting. What made me think to bring this up is you said that pagans weren't religious, and then I was like, well, yeah, given this timestamp and when this word came around, they definitely, by their standards, wouldn't be. But when it first came in as the state of the word religious, and then it's related to, potentially connected to the Latin word religare, which is defined as to restrain.
Right.
To tie back. Yeah.
And so religion in English dates to that period. Does isn't there like a religio
Yeah.
in Latin? How far back does that go? You know more Latin than me.
I know very slightly more Latin than you. It's at least to the 1st century.
Yeah. So
Probably
it could have
before.
referred then to pagans at that time, albeit them.
I think it did.
Pagans.
I think it explicitly did refer to what we would call Roman religion.
Right. And so it would refer then to the state religion at that point.
Yes.
Which was the religion of like the Capitoline gods, who were worshipped as a communal act, a communal act that was supposed to give, power and luck or whatever to the Roman state.
Yes.
And that, I think, fits with the way that I have been thinking about religion as collective rather than individual, right? As the Roman Empire, did kind of what our current civilization is doing and fell apart culturally as well as in other ways. Of course, then people picked up new religions, and you could talk about multiple religions that people had, and some of them were pagan, some of them were, one of them was Christianity, whatever, and people started having even probably something like individual religions. But when you're talking in the 1st century, if you're talking about religion in Rome, you're talking about one thing. Or, there might have, I'm sure there were mystery cults and stuff, but even those weren't exclusive to worshiping the state gods.
Not to get too far down a rabbit hole, but I'm wondering if the communal state religion would also include the individual hearth cults.
Yeah, good question. And I don't know if they would have called those religion or not, right?
Certainly collective.
Yeah.
Within our definition that we're kind of working towards.
But we're talking about individual houses, right? And families.
But within a family, though, as the little smaller collective.
I am not actually qualified to say how far back that goes or what they would have called that cult.
Yep. So anyway, that can be a question that maybe somebody else will answer for us one day, or maybe not. But in any case, I do think that that's at least a fundamental distinction between the two. And I think that, so Nick's description of why people are spiritual rather than religious, it's interesting because I think there are sort of two directions, maybe not two directions, two origins that are almost opposites of each other that cause people to walk away from religion today. On the one hand is what he's talking about, the fear that it's stultifying, fossilized, unchanging, rigid, and people want their freedom. But I think there's also a lot of people who are walking away from religions for exactly the opposite reason. There are a lot of religions that have abandoned whatever their tradition had been. And in the name of evolving to fit the society or something, have become really little more than mirrors of the society, except with Jesus involved, right? So that as opposed to acting as some kind of a moral or ethical compass against the world, right? Because that was always sort of the Christian thing, right? Contra mundi or whatever. Instead, they have turned into just like a fluffy place to go and hang out and learn how you're being a good person for doing exactly what the world, or whatever it is, the secular world wants you to do. There's a lot of the distinction, I think, between sort of the more sort of maybe liberal's the word I'm looking for, Protestant religions has disintegrated. I know I've seen some of this like with religions that certain people in my family are involved with that have gone from being quite unique, right, to turning into really just another kind of bland sort of Protestantism. And if you're in a small church, it's a bland sort of Protestantism, and there's, the Presbyterians across the way who have a big church, you're probably going to the big church. And I think a lot of people, when they see things that were unique to their religion, maybe certain sorts of ideas of moral discipline, maybe certain ideas of theology that they were attached to, and now that you're saying, I don't know if we really meant that, let's just all love each other, they maybe stay home on Sunday, right? And so you've got, I think it goes two ways. People who have felt left in the dirt by the church because they have a church that is not flexible like that. are saying, yeah, bye church. And people who, on the other hand, feel that, they have kept very strong beliefs and the church has just said, yeah, no, that's too hard. We're abandoning that. Those people also are leaving.
Do you think that tracks to like the different sorts of not countercultural, but religious subcultures that we have in the U.S., just to keep it to the situation we're most familiar with?
Yeah.
You think
the only situation I'm familiar with, right? I don't know Europe or anything very well, right?
Right.
I've been to some funerals, but not in Europe. Yeah.
Do you think that tracks to different religious subcultures? Like, we've known that people who were like the free seekers, the new agey sorts of folks, and I can see those being very much the sort of former that you're talking about, the people who feel that whatever the church has, it doesn't have anything to offer them, and so that they're going to go out and try and traverse the wilderness as single people.
I think I could say that I have seen people who were pushed sort of in both directions who come from the same religion. And I'm thinking of Catholics I've known. I've known Catholics who were very traditional, who, already were freaked out by Vatican II, and who, now that they apparently don't have to confess to get saved from hell or whatever, are like, yeah, this church isn't me anymore. And so they're gone. And I've also, and I'm sure you have too, have known Catholics who, just found the whole rigidity and whatever of the fact that it has certain rules about sexuality and about, various other moral rules. Just it's inconsistent with how they want to live, so they leave. So I think that you can have. I think it comes down not maybe so much to different religions doing different things as to people not feeling the need to be as tied back, religio, right, by their religion. And so perhaps in the past, if you were the sort of person who was going to leave the church because it was too conservative, you would have stayed with it because you were also scared to death of going to hell, which you aren't anymore. And perhaps in the past, if you were the sort of person who was going to leave the church because it was too liberal, you wouldn't have in the past because, well, the Pope said that's the way it is, and that's the way it is. Dang it, I guess I'm wrong. Now people are just too damn free-thinking, right? And so they're done in both ways. It's sort of a fundamental part of our society. And really, in a sense, I think maybe both directions come out of modern individualism more than out of any particular characteristic of any particular church.
So due to modern individualism, people are spilling out of the church on both ends.
Yep.
It's interesting when we talked about religion being the collective and spirituality being, seems like there's an interplay between them that can either positively or negatively, kind of more in this context.
So maybe as a way of trying to I think we have to sidle our way up to a definition here at some point.
Yeah.
What are the things that what we call religion and what we call spirituality, what do these things have in common? Well, for one, they overarchingly have something to do with what we would call the supernatural world, right? There's an idea that's held in common that what you see around you isn't all that is, and the sorts of information that you can get through your senses are not presenting you a complete picture of the world. So I think that we can posit that that's something that religion and spirituality has as a common.
I might say we have to be careful about that.
Okay.
First of all, earlier in our conversation, you had talked about how things like Marxism are really kind of religions. Marxism says nothing about any kind of supersensible world.
Not explicitly.
Right? Okay, so implicitly, but even then, I think if we're going to talk about how people are understanding religion, I think that we have to say that at least explicitly, it's not always that.
Okay.
But I would say where I would go with is just a maybe more vague idea that religion claims to have answers about something that's ultimate. Whether those answers are metaphysical, how the world is, or ethical, what the good life is. and that somehow or another it claims both to have those answers. I'm kind of getting this from having read William James a million years ago, so sorry, William James. They also claim that you are better off for accepting this belief now than in the future. I think that's the kind of thing. It's somehow or another they have answers to ultimate questions, and you're better off
now
for doing what those answers tell you to do.
Okay.
I have a definition that I got from a scholar in the field of psychology. He's kind of like built out a little niche at the intersection of psychology and religion. And he says this: the definition for religion is the search for significance that occurs within the context of established institutions that are designed to facilitate spirituality. And then he defines spirituality as the search for the sacred.
Okay. That's actually a really good jumping off point, because I think that if you're talking about the search for significance and you're talking about that kind of definition of religion, you also have to bring back Mircea Eliade, for whom religion was a matter that was concerned primarily with meaning and significance, but in a larger sense than we might normally define those words, right? I think that you can mix in ideas of being as such. The way I understand Eliade's body of scholarship is that being, significance, meaning, these are synonymous terms, and that religion is concerned with discovering meaning and thereby discovering being itself.
There is a lot there, and it's very unpackable, but I think the problem is we're dealing with, trying to talk about being itself is pretty open, right?
Yep, true.
And it's hard to really grasp where we're going with that. Now, with Eliade, of course, there's this idea that there's the sort of eternal, unchanging world outside of time, and that our religious acts are reenactments of things that happen in that world, which are expressed through mythology and so on and so forth, which is, I find, a very useful way of interpreting at least some, and maybe the majority, of religious phenomena. But I don't know, and I used to feel differently than this, but I don't know that I can say that it's all inclusive or that it's a full definition. I think that there are things that it misses in terms of religion and ways that it maybe doesn't get at the core of the whole thing sometimes. But it's a start, right? Again, it comes down to these most important questions, right? Somehow or another, there are answers to what is, to how we should live, to things that we should do. Mm-hmm. These answers do have to do with, being itself, right? What is? And so I can see how, there's some kind of usefulness here, I think. But it's hard then to unpack that, what is being, right? There are whole really gigantic books about that written by impenetrable German authors, for instance.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to make a lot of sense of these things. And so we should probably try to keep with things that are easier to make sense of at this point. And I'm not sure quite where we go with that right now. I think it is important that somehow or another, religious and, these religion-like ideologies do claim to say things about the ultimate meaning of life. Now, sometimes their claims about what is ultimate here are pretty lame, right? Mm-hmm. There's a certain very influential throughout the 20th century and maybe further ideology that said basically that the fundamental truth of existence is economics, right? Mm-hmm. Which was then countered by another ideology that said actually the same thing, just thought that you needed to do something different economically. And we had a whole Cold War over that, right? Mm-hmm. But to me, the idea that the fundamental basis of reality is economics, it's like saying that the fundamental basis of being human is your stomach, right? It's kind of lame. Mm-hmm. I tend to think there's something more to being human than that. Yeah, so that's I'm not sure where to go from there right now, but I think we have to. I think nonetheless, I guess here's where I think we should go from there. I think that we can agree. Spirit. So the psychologist that you brought
Kenneth
up,
Pergamon, yeah.
yeah, his idea of this sort of relationship between religion and spirituality.
Mhm.
Right? Spirituality is a search for the sacred. Religion is the institutional sort of backing for people's search for the sacred.
To help them search for it better.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's a pretty useful definition. I mean, then you got to look at what sacred is. That brought us to Eliade.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know that that's always what sacred is, right? But I that could get us somewhere. And again, that goes with my sense that in America today, spirituality is maybe growing while religion is shrinking because people don't trust the institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
individualism is kind of the zeitgeist of Western ideology.
it seems to be, although then a lot of people seem to be trying to replace it with some kind of weird collectivism too.
Yeah.
But there certainly is something about our culture that is very individualistic, even when we're pretending not to be. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We have this sort of fundamental belief that what we are at bottom is an individual. That things like cultures, institutions, whatever, are merely conglomerations of individuals. And it's hard to put your mind around it, but in a lot of societies, tribal societies, for instance, that's not how they see it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
In tribal societies, the individual is not fundamental. The individual is secondary to the tribe, at least in many of them. Mm-hmm. It's a whole different ontology, a whole different sense of what actually is. And I think that our sense of the nature of the individual, this weird little unit that's out there completely on its own somehow, it's fairly artificial, right? None of us say there's a whole no man is an island, which we've heard so much that we don't know what it means anymore. But it's literally saying that, we are not alone. And individualism says we are. I am the conglomeration of influences from my ancestors, my friends, my enemies, my everything, right? There's never a moment where you are a completely discrete, cut off from everything else individual, unless that moment happens outside of life, which I have very little memory of ever not having been alive. So,
yeah, it's weird that, I think you'll know more about the actual story here, but Descartes, Cartesian philosophy seems to posit from the get-go a kind of discrete unitary nature of the individual. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, in Eliade's book, how you guys are audience members, you're going to get sick of hearing me talk about Eliade. I know it. But in his book on yoga, which I think was the first book he wrote, it's a similar sort of thing. Through following these practices, you become a completely self-supporting and unattached individual, or you realize the fact that that's your true state. So I would say that there are places that you find that outside just modern Western culture, post-Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. I think, though,
Descartes is probably the basis of it, or at least close to that time period. I think is where it became on the ascendant in our culture. And it's interesting that yoga that you're talking about, it's not that you start off with this understanding or that this understanding is basic. It's that this is something you have to attain.
Yes. And I think that has to do with the fact that yoga was coming out of a culture that, like the tribal cultures you're talking about, the individual was subsumed in the collective, right? So you had to come to an understanding of yourself as an individual. Well, what then? Yoga has answers to what then. I think that, what Western culture had to do was, achieve that sort of thing, or at least achieve the expression of it with Descartes. And then what we've seen from there is that more and more any sort of collective cultural identity becomes marginalized over time. And there are reactions to that, right? That's not just a one-way progression over the centuries since Descartes, but you do have kind of a back and forth between individualism and collectivism in Western culture.
any time that you're talking about like big cultural trends, you are leaving out countercultural trends, right?
Yep.
And usually if you're like sort of doing some kind of cultural criticism, when you start describing the culture, you're coming up with some kind of a exaggerated like caricature of culture or something, right? It's not, and that's not necessarily bad. Hopefully you're bringing out something useful in the culture. But that you need to keep it in mind. The fact that you're coming up with some sort of a simplified version of what's happening in a culture isn't necessarily a way of objecting to what you're doing, so long as you're doing it knowingly.
Right.
Right. And so, yeah, there's always been and continue to be people who are trying to move in a direction different from the individualism of modern Western culture. In Western culture, even since the Enlightenment. And before the Enlightenment, there were probably, somewhere some wild like individuals who had wanted to think of themselves as nothing but discrete individuals. But certainly the cultural move since the Enlightenment has been to understand people fundamentally as individuals. You can see it in political philosophy, right? Whether it's John Locke or Thomas Hobbes, it all starts from something like a social contract or something where a bunch of individuals who start off with no ties to anyone, right? For John Locke, man in a state of nature was in a state of war of the war of all against all the time, right? A state of life that was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, because all that you did was wandered around and hit other people over the head so you could get their stuff, and you had no connections to any of them. It's kind of hard to see how like people grew out of childhood this way, but it's a simplification.
That's rough. That's a rough ideology.
Babies were tougher back then.
Got these soft babies that are literally hard babies.
That's right. Back then they were like rocks.
Yeah.
They wouldn't wait for their mothers to feed them. They would attack those mothers. They were dangerous little buggers.
Weird times.
So that's an important point. We've talked a lot about the kind of the nature of individualism, a little bit about the nature of collectivism. We've also talked about individualism and kind of group identity in terms of, spirituality and religion. I'm reaching for a question here and I'm having a little bit of difficulty putting it into words, but I think that, I'm interested to know what a view of the self as an individual, a discrete individual with nothing more than accidental connections to anyone else. What sort of obligations or relationships are made necessary from that point of view towards religion versus a more collective or group identity sort of point of view?
So I think we could make a really big contrast between two very separate religions, right? Christianity, which we're all very aware of, growing up in the West and all that, is a religion that is based around the idea of individuality. If the Enlightenment brought us something new, I think that it was only a return to what's really at the root of Christianity as it's understood by, sort of the Orthodox Christians, not just Eastern Orthodox, but, Catholics and whatever, and even Protestants, which is this idea that we're all sinners. We need to be saved. We can be saved because Jesus got himself nailed to a piece of wood and off we go, right? But the thing is that the ultimate goal of this religion is not the well-being of a community. It's not anything other than the salvation of the individuals who have decided to be a part of the religion. If there is a Christian community, its purpose is to help those individuals to find their individual salvation. And indeed, a lot of what Christianity is a cutting off of people from their cultures that existed before or outside of Christianity in order to adopt Christianity. This is explicit in some Bible verses, right? You're not Greeks or whoever else anymore. You're Christians, right? I was going to say I think that's in some epistle. I'm probably not the right one to be asking for Bible quotes, so I'll stop now.
If any listeners can provide us with that, that would be great.
But On the other hand, something that they would have been very aware of was something like, Greek or Roman religion, which are in fact different things. But these were religions where early on it was going to be a city state. Later on, it was, of course, the big old state, the Roman state or whatever. And there was a cult. And this cult, now on the one hand, there were like household cults and things like this. People would make offerings to worship their ancestors or their house gods. And this would give well-being, luck, whatever to their family, their household. And then the state itself had, the state gods, and they would do the rituals that were appropriate to worship those gods. And when they did them right, they would receive the blessings of those gods. The state would receive those blessings. The goal was not the well-being of any particular individual. The goal was the well-being of the state, which sometimes might mean, the well-being of the state might mean we're going to win a war and a whole bunch of you are going to die, right? But we're going to win. It might mean something like that. And so the difference there is a difference between a religion that is individualistic and is involved with its ultimate goal is the well-being of individuals. It's, their salvation, which is sort of the long-term well-being, because I've heard that hell sucks, I don't know, at least the Christian one. On the other hand, the concern of something like Roman or Greek religion, and again, I said something about how you simplify when you make these vast generalizations. And there's some simplification here. There are always mystery cults and stuff, and we can get into that later, I suppose.
Oh, and not even that. I mean, there's plenty of examples of individual citizens of a particular city-state petitioning the gods on their own behalf, like
right.
for cures, for luck in merchant ventures, to make sure that they come home from the war, etc. Mm-hmm. So it's not that it's either or. It's either the entire state or it's individual people.
And there's certainly, Christians would, pray for the well-being of their country or whatever too, right? But the ultimate goal, though, it was not as individuals, I don't think. Mystery cults, like I say, that's a different area. And indeed, I would say that Christianity is a mystery cult that, lost perspective, but that's,
Sure.
These are different kinds of religion. The salvific religions are religions that are where spirituality, as we had defined it earlier, is maybe stronger than it necessarily is for most people involved with the state religions, right? With the Roman or the Greek religion, and I would say with Germanic religion like we practice. When you look at the way that these sort of state-type religions worked, where these religions were about keeping the tribe, the state, whatever around. It's not about anything, well, I shouldn't say it quite that way, but it is about the earthly success and survival of the group, whatever that group is. When you're dealing with salvific religions, it's not necessarily. And indeed, we can see there are religions that are offshoots of this that were specifically opposed really to their own earthly survival, right? Look at the Shakers. These people were nuts, right? But sex is bad. So they are never going to have sex. They're going to adopt kids and that's it. And of course, there are no Shakers anymore because guess what happens when you never have sex? You don't have kids, and eventually the kids that you adopt are like, what the hell? This is a bad idea. And then your religion dies. But that was a Christian religion, a salvific religion. Sex was something that got you sent to hell, so you shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, and I think that at some point in the future, we should probably make a distinction between world accepting versus world rejecting religions. But
right.
The point that I wanted to get to right now is that in such a well-developed thing like Roman religion or Greek religion, it's important to note that, yes, the overarching theme of it is the worldly well-being of the culture as a whole, but that in healthy religions, there is also room for individual cultists. There is room for those people that, we might call spiritual, the seekers. There are ways for people with differing levels of interest in and devotion to religious goals to achieve those goals, right? Not everyone has to be, meditating for 7 hours a day and fasting every third, right? But
Right.
there should be practices in place. I think in the ancient world, there definitely were practices in place for the people who wanted to go that hard. And there were plenty of other, religious options for people who didn't want to go that hard. They wanted to, make sure that their ancestors were watching over them. They wanted to make sure that they were good with the gods, and then they wanted to get about their daily, non-religious lives. Although even saying that you have your daily non-religious life is kind of a misnomer when we're talking about a lot of ancient cultures.
Yep.
Because a lot of the sorts of things that you would do as a farmer, for instance, as a merchant, a lot of the practices did have religious practices associated with them because there wasn't this clear distinction. So don't, audience, no one in the audience should take it to say that I'm thinking that in the ancient world, there were religious things that you could do, set aside, and then get on with everything else. There were profane things. There were definitely things that were not associated with religion. And that's a fascinating topic in and of itself. I guess the overarching point that I'm trying to make is that there's a place in these sort of collective state religions for things that are on behalf of everyone else. There are religious practices that are, those who want to have just a minimal input, and there are practices for people who really want to dive in and do the work.
Right. There's always going to be an array of practices. And certainly if your collective's doing well, the hope is that at least most people will be doing well. But I think you can see a difference in such things as like the serious negative consequences of having the wrong belief if you were a Christian at a certain time.
Yeah.
You rarely see that kind of thing in pagan religions, right?
Yeah.
In non-Christian religions and in the kinds of religions that I think of as collective. There, the major thing that's important is that you be able to do the rituals.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter. And the reason why is because the rituals affect everyone. If you're part of the collective, you need to be part of the ritual. And if you aren't, there's a problem. Whereas if you're a Christian, whether you do the ritual is kind of less important than whether you're a heretic. Right? Zoroastrianism is it's a little bit of a particular thing and is gonna, if we were to get into it in any depth, it would cause us some confusion in our topic. So we won't do that necessarily. But one interesting thing about Zoroastrianism is that for a very long time, there was sort of a Zoroastrian heresy that is called Zurvanism that said not that Ahura Mazda was the sort of ultimate god and Ahriman was less than him as the evil god, but that both Ahriman and Ahura Mazda, and I might be getting this wrong, but I think I'm getting it right, come from Zurvan.
Who's the god of time, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that the good god and the evil god are on equal footing underneath of this sort of, neither good nor evil god of time. But the thing about this heresy was that you could have two people, one of whom was a Zurvanist and one of whom was a Orthodox, if that's the word we're looking for, Zoroastrian, and they could go to the same dang temple and do the same thing, and there was no necessary difference. And therefore, there were no great purges of Zurvanists. They didn't throw them all into fires. Well, they wouldn't do that, of course, because Zoroastrians, fires are sacred and you don't put bad things into fires. So they would do something else. But they didn't do any of that, right? They didn't have vast, horrifying purges of the people who believed wrong because the important thing was the collective ritual.
Yeah, you can see the same thing in India before the Mughals, where going back a very, very long time, you have Hinduism, or the different varieties of cultists that we put under the umbrella of Hinduism that are ritually polytheistic, that nevertheless have had polytheistic, monotheistic, monistic, and atheistic interpretations.
Mm-hmm.
And there were different schools of thought here, and they had debates, and they could call each other all kinds of names, but it doesn't seem to have ever flared up into actual violence, right? People could disagree with one another, but so long as they were following the same religious practice, then all was for the good, right? So even what we might call a state religion, a state polytheism, has room in it for multiple different kinds of belief under the same set of rituals. I think that's a really, really important point, and it goes against what we tend to think of as the definition of religion today, which is primarily creedal.
Right. Yep. And it's primarily creedal, again, for the same reason that people think of religion as primarily monotheistic. It's because the hegemonic religion in our part of the world has been a creedal monotheistic religion. Most religions throughout history were not creedal, right? I mean, if we assume that every tribe had a tribal religion, I mean, if that's how we're going to count religions, we got a lot of tribal religions, and most of them were not creedal.
So then I think it would be good to start talking about, what does this mean for the modern heathen, right? For the person who is trying to figure out if Germanic religion is the religion they want to practice, or how to do that. What does it mean to practice Germanic religion? If we have these different definitions and we're diving in deep to what religion is, not just from a monotheistic or Abrahamic perspective, what would be some of the, I can think of several important takeaways.
Yeah.
But you go first.
I think the first important takeaway is that we need to, as much as possible, act in collectivities, right? Whatever we're calling them, whatever your heathen tradition is, and you're a kindred or whatever, or like us, you're a theid. You need to be thinking in terms of a group. You need to be thinking in terms of, there's always this, orthopraxy versus orthodoxy, right? You do need to be thinking in terms of orthopraxy, in terms of acting the right way, in terms of doing the right rituals. Now, that means that you have to figure out what the heck those are. And honestly, that is a fraught question, right?
Yes.
Maybe for another time, but that should be where you're thinking. You should not be arguing with other people in heathenry about what they believe, except for I shouldn't say it that way. You shouldn't be condemning other people as not being heathens for what they believe. You should be condemning them for not being heathens, perhaps, if they act in a way that's contrary to what you consider to be correct action.
Yeah, I would add to that. So we just covered like acting in collectives. And then I would just say on the other end of that spectrum, like be aware of what you're personally bringing to that collective too. I think that's like the other important end of this is.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. We've seen for longer than I've been part of heathenry has been fractious, and we're not the only one, right? Mm-hmm. I would say that any sort of countercultural or subcultural religious group in the West has been incredibly fractious going back, a couple centuries. I would say that Christianity has been fractious going back to the Reformation and before, right? So it seems to be, and potentially that has to do with the deeply individualistic nature of Western culture, that sort of base assumption leads to splintering. It leads to fractioning. I think that if we're going to do good things in the world, if we're going to do good things by heathenry, then we need to be able to overcome a lot of that sort of fracturing tendency.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's hard to argue otherwise, right? I mean, don't get me wrong. There are things that many heathens say and state they believe that make me a little nuts, right? But you know what? That's fine so long as they're acting in a certain way, right? So long as they're doing the rituals and honestly, I have a pretty open sense of what those need to be, but it seems to me that any particular group at least should have its own set of what they think are the right things to do. and people should act in accordance with those, right? The fractiousness has not been good. But, think about it. Who becomes a heathen? Someone who has already rejected either the religion they grew up with or just the sort of generic secularism of the Western world. They have decided to do something already that sets them off from everything else. And that means they have already engaged in a serious kind of rejection. Mm-hmm. And so they come in here and they join some group. And, after a little bit, that group isn't quite what they want either. Well, these aren't people who are used to just taking it when they don't agree with the group, right?
Yeah.
So instead, they're like, well, fuck that group, and off they go.
Right.
Are we allowed to swear in our podcast?
I think that if
so. Okay, I hope so.
Phil Ford and J.F. Martell can say fuck, then so can we.
Okay, I'll go with that.
Our hero podcast.
Yes.
So we strive, we're trying to live up to.
J.F. Phil, we love you guys.
Till we pass them, and then we'll have to look up to Joe Rogan or something, I guess.
Oh, good God.
Please no. Please no.
No? Okay.
Yeah.
See, this is why you need a collective around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Otherwise, I would have just started liking Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
Put a picture of him in your shrine or something.
Yeah.
But no, so other sorts of takeaways for modern heathens. One, I think, over the last decade or more, people have been talking a lot about orthopraxy versus orthodoxy, and I think that that's the right way to go. I know that sometimes people get kind of paralyzed. Well, there's so little left remaining of what we know about pre-Christian heathen orthopraxy. What are the right practices? And there are some that you can know for sure through research. At least, we have a pretty good idea. But it's also important to note that this isn't a mechanism that we're trying to put together, and that if we put together the mechanism the correct way, then we'll get the correct results in the end. There's someone listening on the other end of your communications with the divine. And I strongly believe that if you are trying the best you can to perform the right practices, and if you are continually trying to be better at how you live your life, how you practice your rituals, they will see that and they will accept it. Mm-hmm. Which doesn't mean that, you can just pour out a can of Bud and say, yeah, we're good. Me and the gods are good, we're buddies now. It's not like that. You actually do have to try. There has to be effort involved. There has to be striving involved, at least if not on behalf of everyone who is practicing the religion, at least someone in the collective has to be striving to do things better, right? Someone in your group needs to be doing that. Maybe it's you, dear listener. Maybe it's not you and you know who it is, but I have a feeling that if you're listening to a podcast like this, you're probably looking for some ideas and some deeper treatments of heathenry. So maybe it is you.
What would you guys say to folks that say that we don't need religion as humans anymore?
It's so distant from my way of thinking that it's hard to respond to, right?
Yeah.
It's
a sentiment held by, I hear it quite a bit online nowadays. It's just like, we're done with that. And
yep.
And I agree though. It's distant from.
I feel that, that kind of life just seems barren to me. And I say that I have friends, relatives who are, atheists or whatever, and their lives don't seem barren like they live in darkness and whatever. But it does seem to be missing something fundamental, right? Now, if you think the only option religiously is, some kind of Christianity.
Or if you think that other religions are just Christianity with different body paint.
Right.
Yeah.
I to some degree, I can understand it. Although even then, I think I'd rather be a Catholic than an atheist. I don't know.
And I think the people that would say that wouldn't say the same thing about spirituality. It's a pure religious thing, and it probably calls back to, the connotations that they're thinking of.
I think some of them would say that about spirituality, though, too. Absolutely.
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah, there's lots of people who think that the only way forward, again, talking about the idea of progress, the only way forward is to just get rid of all what they lump under the moniker of superstition and be perfect rationalists, but they're betrayed by the fact that the idea of progress itself as an arc of history is itself a religious idea insofar as it posits an overall topography or geometry to being as such.
It's certainly a superstition.
No.
Yeah, I suppose these are the kinds of people who say something like no gods, no masters or whatever, right? And it's this sort of idea of some kind of radical freedom where, no one's telling you what to do, whether they're real or not. No imaginary friends in the sky, all that shit, right? Certainly my experience with gods is that they exist. I don't know exactly what that means sometimes, but there's something there. And so I have a little bit of a problem with that, just on that basis. But if they haven't had that experience, I guess, it's, what do you do? The other part of that, I suppose, is this idea that you can live in some kind of radical freedom with everybody doing their own thing, which, of course, is never how humanity has been, but unless you think that Hobbes actually makes sense when he says that at some point we were living in a state of nature knocking each other over the head, right? But that human beings have never lived like that. We've always had like societies. We've always had maybe not masters, but certainly rules, right? That
Leadership.
we lived by.
Yeah.
And there might be some like tribal groups that were profoundly egalitarian or something. But there's always something there. There's always something that
You still need some kind
freedom.
of
There needs to be structure. Right?
collaboration at the very
Well, because reality constricts your freedom. There are many things I can't do. I will never be a basketball star, even though I'm tall, especially at this point in my life. It's not going to happen, right? And there are a number of reasons for that, which have a lot to do with the fact that I'm, 52 years old. I can't even remember how old I am anymore. And I'm so old. And I'm not going to be able to do that, right? I'm probably never going to be president of the United States, although with some of the people who get that job, what the hell? Maybe I could. There are any number of things I'm never going to be able to do. And I don't have the freedom to do. I don't have the freedom to just walk away from everything in my life right now because, I'd end up, number one, letting down people who rely on me, right? My family and such. And number two, I'd probably starve to death, right? Because I wouldn't have food and money and stuff. There are things you just can't do. Life is itself a constriction on your freedom. Not that I don't like freedom. I think we all like freedom, but that's a thing. And for a lot of people, especially if they have grown up with that kind of idea of, mean old God in the sky yelling at you about what a sinner you are, they associate the divine with not just a constriction on freedom, but an arbitrary constriction on freedom. And for such people, I think it makes a lot of, I shouldn't say it makes a lot of sense, but from their perspective, it makes a lot of sense that when they see people talking about gods, they're like, I don't like that stuff. I don't need religion because religion is just,
on
the
the Latin
sky telling
root,
me I
like to
suck.
tie back to to restrain. I mean, they're not entirely wrong in some ways.
Yeah.
When we're talking about how to act or thinking through how to act in the world and using spirituality or religion, more specifically religion.
I think the question is, what are you being tied back to, right?
Right. Yeah. And that could be a good thing. I mean, yeah.
It should be, right? I tend to think, tie back. It's another word for reconnection, right? I think that if you're doing religion right, you're being tied back to the ultimate ground of being in some way. And I realize I talked earlier about how you start talking about things like being itself and nobody knows what you're talking about. I'm just going to stop with ultimate ground of being anyway. I know nobody knows what I'm talking about, but think about it for a while. Maybe it'll mean something. There is an important sense in which, right, you get tied back to, let's just say, reality. It's actually not a very good word, but we'll use it anyway. You are tied back to what actually is. That's not a bad thing. Yes, it constrains your freedom, but if your freedom is just to wander about, not not attached to what actually is, not attached to ultimate truths, maybe you want to constrict that freedom a little bit because there's a greater goal than that freedom.
Well, I think too, that's a great way to put it. And following up on that, it depends on what your primary conception of the human is, right? If your primary conception of the human is this being that is radically individual, then trying to attain radical freedom for yourself makes a certain degree of sense, right?
You're just picking back up on the proper essence of being human.
Absolutely.
Yep.
But on the other hand, if your idea of what it means to be human is to be part of a collective, then being tied back is the opposite of being cast adrift.
Right.
And if you look at human society throughout history and prehistory, anthropologically speaking, there has never been a time that we can see that humanity has been radically individualistic. All human beings are a kind of collective animal, and we have to accept that if we're going to get to the root of what it is to live as a human.
Thank you for listening to the North Star Podcast. For more information about us, visit axenthof.com. That's AXENTHOF.com. In our next episode, to be published on February 17th, which is also a solar eclipse, by the way, we'll discuss the topic of quality versus quantity as it relates to living a good heathen life.